Hey folks, Kent Ketter back here with another hot take with Team Cardhoarder, bringing you a spicy one from the weekend. So, GP Rimini, we had Lucas Blohan, our recent Pro Tour champion, show up with a real nice one. Blue-red spells. Now, most of you know this as the blue-red deck that was played by Pedro Carvalho. Apologies if I butchered your name, at the Pro Tour. Well, Lucas took it, and in my opinion, improved upon it greatly. Now, realize that at the Pro Tour, there's a lot of inbreeding in the metagame, so they've got to play specific cards to beat the perceived best deck and the deck that will most likely be played, as like the level 1 response to the best deck. So, if you look at Pedro's list from the PT, you'll see some cards that maybe are a little, you question a couple things, but I feel like Lucas took a step back almost and went to the most consistent list that he could put together, emphasizing the most powerful cards in the archetype. So let's take a quick look here and see what we got. The biggest things to note are these 2 drops. Stormchaser Mage is Lucas's new inclusion, and that does a great job of complementing the Thermo Alchemist. So for those unaware, Thermo Alchemist deals 1 damage to each opponent. Any instant or sorcery, you untap it. You can think of it as +1 damage. You can think of it as prowess. You can think of it as a few different things, but really it just ups the damage by 1 tick, and that's a fantastic effect that a lot of folks will come to enjoy. Same thing on Stormchaser Mage. Evasion, prowess, it's going to make all your damage spells deal a little bit more. So let's go to the actual spells in the deck. 1 mana interaction, real important for your Bant Company matchups, and then Lightning Axe gives you something a little bit bigger to deal with maybe your Ishkanahs and the like. Ishkanah is really just a tough one for this deck. Incendiary Flow, Collective Defiance, Fiery Temper, and Exquisite Firecraft all give you direct damage. Defiance also gives you a nice little discard and redraw if you've got a hand filled up with lands, which is important to note with this deck. After you've played like your 3rd or 4th land, you can really hold on to the extras. It has a upside with Collective Defiance. Then we have Firecraft, 4 damage, nothing fancy there. Fiery Temper, real nice to note with this one. You could discard it to Tormenting Voice or to hand size in some situations and get it for that cheap trigger. Also, Gyro Reach Sanitarium, similar effect there. But 3 damage instant speed, fantastic, we'll take it. And then kind of the centerpiece of the deck's strategy and what makes it work. I had to read this card a couple times to make sure I was fully understanding what was going on with it. But end of each player's step, that player draws a card. If the player, and this is the important part, if the player is your opponent and they have 4 or more cards, which is not that many, they also take 2. So typically the turn 3 Fevered Visions, you'll draw a card, they'll draw a card, and then they'll take 2. Untap and you repeat that process. It seems like a great way to get ahead really quickly. Let's go to the sideboard real quick. Got some more creature interaction in Lightning Axe and Nahiri's Wrath. Nahiri's Wrath is really interesting in that you can discard 1, 2, 3 cards, as you see sufficient. You can even discard a land in like a Fiery Temper, and that will let you spread 3 damage out to 2 targets, which is pretty nice because it is... Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. It is damage equal to the total converted mana cost of the discarded cards to each of up to X target creatures. So if you go Wrath, discarding Fiery Temper and 2 lands, you're going to deal 3/3/3 to the 3 targets. Let me read this the 3rd time. I read this card beforehand, but I just want to make sure that I'm not passing on some bad information. Correct. Discard X cards. So we'll say Fiery Temper, land. It'll deal damage equal to the total converted mana cost, which would be 3/0/0, so 3. To X creatures or planeswalkers. Getting the planeswalkers is also nice. You've got Jace for your control matchups or matchups where you really just want another go around with your spells. I typically envision this as a control matchup card. Additionally, the Bedlam Reveler. You could also bring in Jace in situations where you're light on removal, or they're light on removal. I think it has an application against Bant Company, but giving Reflector Mage some additional targets might not be the best idea. I think Stormchaser might be hard-pressed to damage. Dispel for Bant Company, Gold Knight Castigator, removal spell, decks that might trim on removal, or if you just want, if they are light on removal, Gold Knight will do a great job of pushing through damage there. For the most part, the abilities don't really matter when you bring this in. And the good thing to keep in mind with Gold Knight is you have to ask yourself, how much damage can they do, and is it appropriate for me to bring this card in? I would tell you to avoid it against the other red decks. I would tell you to avoid it against anything more aggressive than you. It is not something that you want to be, necessarily racing with. You also want to be pretty conservative when you run it out there. If you run the card out there and then let's say they have like a shambling vent or something, it seems like it creates a weird situation where you're trying to trade well, now they're dealing you 4. So careful with that card. And then the last one's Bedlam Reveler. This feels like the correct card to bring in for your control matchups. You're going to be casting spells, going through, your loops, getting damage on them, and then just to be able to pitch maybe a land or a Fiery Temper and draw 3 more cards seems great. So, one thing I wanted to do this week with the column and kind of get a better idea of when I do my assessments here is just wanted to really point out in the sideboard. I see this as a mid-range or non-aggressive creature deck where this would come in. I would want this against something like Bant Company, I believe. Avacyn doesn't trade with it. Spellqueller doesn't really do much against it. Reveler I want against my control decks, and I think Jace is going to fall into a similar position. Dispel against your company decks. And then Nahiri's Wrath and Lightning Axes against your aggressive decks. I think it's really important with this to keep in mind that your main deck is already set up really well with a lot of removal spells and the like, so we don't want to overboard with the deck. Just to go to the main deck, control matchups, probably going to cut the Axes and Impulses, bring in some combination of like Revelers and Vryn's Prodigies. Against the aggressive decks, we'll cut out the less efficient cards like Firecraft, probably some Fevered Visions as well. This doesn't have as much text against the aggressive strategy, so we'll want to cut those and probably some of these Firecrafts for a combination of Wraths and Gold Knight Castigators. So pretty excited to give this a spin. Jace will be a card that I admittedly will probably be boarding incorrectly in a few situations, but we're going to see where it takes us. And let's go off to a league, put it through 5 matches, and see what we think. I am very excited about this week's deck. The last couple weeks, I've played a few decks that, weren't really my style, felt like they were decent, but not great. Some wonderful pilots behind them, but not something that on the hot take I really felt like had that nice power level. This is something I'm considering for the Invitational. I think the deck's extremely powerful. Todd Anderson took down a Classic this weekend with a different version, but I really wanted to highlight Stormchaser Mage and its ability to really bring the plan together to get some punishing draws. Higher count on Tormenting Voice lets you offset, some of your lands that maybe don't have the highest impact. So we'll jump into the queues. We'll see what happens. Hope you'll see me there. This was Kent Ketter with Hot Takes. Check me out for match 1.